The velvet ropes at the entrance of the city's annual charity gala felt less like a gateway to a glamorous evening and more like a noose tightening around my throat. My stepdaughter, Chloe, stood by the podium with a champagne flute in her hand, her laughter ringing out across the ballroom as she looked me dead in the eye and loudly whispered to a group of investors, "Don't bother with her. She's just the hired help's replacement. A nobody from nowhere who barely knows how to hold a fork." The room went deathly silent as my husband Arthur stood right beside her, staring at the floorboards instead of defending his wife of 10 years, his silence echoing louder than any insult could. What they didn't know, and what I had kept buried under layers of suburban mundanity for over a decade, was that the very charity foundation they were currently raising money for was built entirely on the trust fund that bore my grandfather's crest, a lineage that made Chloe's blue-blooded socialite status look like common soot in comparison. 3 weeks ago, our life had felt like a perfectly curated photograph. We lived in a sprawling, cedar-shingled estate on the edge of the coast, a house that smelled perpetually of expensive wax, fresh eucalyptus, and the sea salt that rolled off the cliffs. Arthur was an architect, a man whose hands were always stained with lead and ink, and I was the support system, the woman who managed his schedule, curated his art collection, and most importantly, kept the bank accounts flowing. I had met Arthur when he was a struggling junior partner, and I had used the inheritance from my maternal estate to bridge the gap between his ambition and his lack of capital. I was happy to remain the invisible engine behind his career. Chloe, his daughter from his first marriage, had moved in with us 2 years prior. She was 22, with a sharp jawline and a sharper tongue, and she had spent every day since her arrival trying to prune me out of the family tree like a diseased branch. I had let it slide. I viewed her behavior as a byproduct of a fractured childhood, a defense mechanism against a woman who had stepped into her mother's role. I was kind, I was patient, and I was perpetually oblivious to the way she looked at the heavy mahogany desk in my study. That desk was where I kept my life in a locked drawer. Specifically, it held the legacy documents, the original deeds to the coastal property, the stocks in the shipping firm my great-grandfather had founded, and the sealed correspondence with the estate lawyers in London. I had never felt the need to flaunt these things. I was comfortable. I loved the way the morning light hit the breakfast nook when Arthur drank his black coffee, the way he would absent-mindedly rub his thumb over my knuckles when he was deep in thought. Or so I told myself. Looking back, the cracks were there, hair thin but spreading. Arthur had started coming home later, complaining about client dinners, where Chloe was frequently present. He had started asking more specific, pointed questions about my liquid assets, how quickly I could access the trust, why the house was titled solely in my name, and whether I felt it was fair to keep such large sums of money in a stagnant account when he could leverage it for the firm's expansion. I had laughed it off. I thought he was just frustrated by the market volatility. I didn't see the greedy glint in his eyes that mirrored the calculating stare Chloe had practiced in the mirror for months. I saw my husband and his daughter. They saw a treasure chest that had finally stopped locking its lid. The house felt warmer than usual that Tuesday afternoon, a heavy, suffocating kind of warmth that made the air feel thick against my skin. I had just walked through the front door, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble of the foyer, carrying a bouquet of white lilies that Arthur had mentioned he liked. I heard voices coming from the sunroom, low, rhythmic, and urgent. They weren't fighting, they were plotting. "She's too naive," I heard Chloe say, her voice dripping with a sneer I had never heard her use. "She thinks we love her. She's just a placeholder, a bank account with a heartbeat. Once we get the power of attorney, we can sell the estate and move to the city. You said yourself, Dad, you're tired of playing house with a woman who has no idea who she actually is." I stopped dead in my tracks, the lilies trembling in my hands. The floral scent suddenly turned cloying, nauseating. Arthur's voice followed, sounding colder, flatter than I had ever heard it. "She's a dreamer, Chloe. She thinks that money is just safety. She doesn't realize that in this world, safety is just another commodity to be traded. Once I have the documents, she won't even have a roof over her head. Don't worry, I've already drafted the papers. She'll sign them during the gala under the guise of an investment consolidation. She's so desperate for my approval, she'd sign away her soul if I asked her nicely." I felt the blood drain from my face, a sudden, sharp coldness radiating from my chest to my fingertips. My pulse was a frantic bird trapped in my throat. I stood in the shadow of the hallway, watching through the glass panes as they toasted with glasses of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the setting sun. They weren't just taking my money, they were mocking my kindness, stripping away the dignity I had afforded them for years. I looked down at the lilies. They looked like funeral flowers now. I didn't drop them. I didn't scream. Instead, I stood there, listening to the man I loved describe exactly how he intended to bury me alive, and for the first time in my life, I felt the soft, useless part of me die. In its place, something jagged and cold began to harden. The week following that discovery was a masterclass in psychological warfare. I lived in a state of suspended animation, moving through the rooms of our house like a ghost haunting my own life. Every time Arthur touched my shoulder or asked about my day, his palm felt like a brand of iron against my skin. I watched him closely now, stripped of the rose-colored glasses of affection. I noticed the way his eyes darted toward my purse whenever I entered a room, and how Chloe had started leaving her laptop open on the kitchen island, deliberately, I realized, to taunt me with the screensaver of a high-rise penthouse in the city. The early warning signs that I had previously dismissed as domestic friction now looked like the well-oiled gears of a machine. Arthur began forgetting his work keys, leaving his phone unlocked on the counter while he showered. I knew he was baiting me, hoping I would provide him with a reason to lash out and claim I was unstable. He started talking about a business opportunity that required an immediate influx of capital from my personal trust, painting it as a way for us to retire early. "Think of the freedom, darling," he would say, his voice a soft, manipulative velvet. "We could get rid of this old house, leave all the memories behind. Just you and me." Chloe, meanwhile, became aggressively affectionate, a sudden, saccharine shift that made my teeth ache. She offered to help me organize the study, specifically the area near the mahogany desk. "Let me take the paperwork load off your back, stepmom," she'd coo, her eyes searching for the keys I kept hidden in a velvet-lined box in my jewelry cabinet. I played the part perfectly. I acted the fragile, distracted wife, the woman who was so swept up in the romantic notion of our new beginning that she was willing to sign anything. I even left a fake set of keys to the desk in my coat pocket, knowing full well she'd find them. The point of no return arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of gray, drizzling day that turns the coastline into a blur of slate and foam. Arthur was at a board meeting, and Chloe had gone into town, leaving the house unnervingly quiet. I felt the familiar pull of the study, but this time, the air in the room felt ionized, charged with the weight of what I had to do. I didn't go for the desk drawer where they expected me to. Instead, I went to the small, unassuming wall safe hidden behind the heavy landscape painting, the one that even Arthur believed was broken. I spun the dial, the clicks sounding like gunshots in the silence. Inside was the ledger that traced the true lineage of my family's wealth, along with the original ironclad trust documents that no amount of power of attorney trickery could touch. But that wasn't what stopped my heart. As I rifled through the file, a piece of cream-colored stationery slipped out, a legal document from a firm I didn't recognize. My hands, usually steady, began to tremble so violently that I had to sit on the floor, the cold hardwood pressing against my legs. It was a formal petition for a competency hearing, filed in Arthur's name. He wasn't just planning to swindle me, he was planning to have me declared mentally unfit, a fragile woman suffering from nervous exhaustion, who needed her assets managed by her devoted, noble husband. The room tilted. I felt the bile rise in my throat, a sour, metallic burn. I looked at the signatures on the bottom of the petition. Not just Arthur's, but a signature from a doctor I had seen once for a routine checkup, now acting as a witness to a breakdown I never had. The betrayal hit me with such force that I physically gasped, my chest heaving as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the house. I wasn't just a mark to them. I was a casualty of war. I sat there for a long time, the rain tapping against the window panes like a countdown. My mind, which had been foggy for years, suddenly snapped into sharp, crystalline focus. The memories of his tenderness, his late nights, his whispered endearments, they all curdled into a singular, ugly truth. They weren't just thieves, they were vultures waiting for me to stop twitching. I looked at the document, then back at the desk. I realized then that I couldn't just leave. I couldn't just run away with my tail between my legs, because they would hunt me, they would frame me, and they would leave me with nothing. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and walked to the window. I looked out at the path leading to the front gate. I saw Arthur's car pulling into the drive, headlamps cutting through the gloom. A strange, cold stillness settled over me. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, lethal resolve. I didn't hide the documents back in the safe. I walked to the kitchen and grabbed a glass of water, my hands now perfectly still. I heard the front door open, the sound of Arthur's voice calling out, "Darling, I'm home! Did you have a chance to look over those papers?" I didn't answer. I just waited in the shadows of the hallway, a predator disguised as a victim, watching as the man who had traded his soul for my inheritance walked straight into the web I was about to weave. The sound of Arthur's footsteps on the foyer tiles was heavy, confident, and utterly oblivious. He walked toward the kitchen, his tie loosened, whistling a soft, tuneless melody. I stood in the darkened archway of the study, the legal petition clutched in my left hand, my shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor. When he rounded the corner, he stopped, his smile faltering as he caught sight of me. He didn't notice the document yet. He only noticed the silence. "You're in the dark, honey," he said, his voice dropping into that smooth, patronizing register he used when he wanted me to feel small. "Did you lose your way in your own home?" I didn't move. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, agonizing beat. "I found my way, Arthur," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally calm, like the surface of a frozen lake. "I found a lot of things today. I found a petition for a competency hearing. I found a doctor's signature that I'm quite certain will end his career by morning. And I found out exactly how much you value the decade we spent building this life." The color drained from his face so rapidly that he looked like a wax statue under the dim, recessed lighting. His hands, which had been reaching for a wineglass, froze in midair. "What are you talking about? You've been reading my private work files again, haven't you? That's exactly the kind of erratic behavior that—" "Don't you dare," I interrupted, stepping out of the shadows. I held up the document, the paper crisp and threatening. "Don't you dare try to gaslight me in my own house, in front of the evidence that proves you've been planning to strip me of my autonomy for months. I know about the Gala, Arthur. I know about your investment consolidation. I know that you and Chloe are not just partners, you're predators." Before he could answer, a sharp, indignant laugh echoed from the top of the stairs. Chloe stood there, her hands on her hips, her eyes flashing with a cocktail of annoyance and panic. She descended the stairs, her movements jerky and defensive. "Oh, give it a rest, you hysterical brat," she spat, her usual facade of charm shattering instantly. "You were never really one of us. You were a bank account that got a little too attached to its owner. Did you really think someone like him would stay with someone like you forever?" She moved to stand beside her father, her chin tilted up in a challenge. "You don't understand how the world works," Chloe continued, her voice rising in a jagged, shrill tone. "You're an heiress by accident, a lucky sperm in a rich man's bed. Dad is an architect. He builds things. He deserves the resources to actually make something of his life, not waste them on your boring, charity-ridden mediocrity." Arthur finally found his voice, but it was hollow, devoid of any warmth. "She's right, Eleanor. You've been an anchor on my potential for years. Every time I ask for an investment, every time I need to expand the firm, I have to beg you for your signature. It's emasculating. You think you're helping, but you're just controlling me through the checkbook. This was the only way to level the playing field." "Level the playing field?" I whispered, my heart rate steady, my mind racing ahead of them. "You call framing your wife for a mental breakdown leveling the playing field? You call stealing from the family that fed you entrepreneurship?" "We didn't steal anything," Arthur barked, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. "I earned every cent of this lifestyle by putting up with your suffocating, quiet presence for 10 years. And now, you're going to be a good little girl, you're going to sign the transfer documents, and you're going to walk away quietly. If you don't, well, I have that affidavit from Dr. Miller. I'll have you committed to a private facility before you can call a lawyer. Who do you think they'll believe? The successful architect or the woman who clearly lost her mind?" I looked at them. Two people who had shared my table, my bed, and my secrets, now baring their teeth with the desperation of cornered animals. I saw the greed in their eyes, the total absence of remorse. It was a terrifying realization, but as I looked at them, I felt a strange, cold clarity. They thought they had trapped me, but they had forgotten one fundamental thing about the lineage I came from. We didn't just inherit money, we inherited the ruthlessness required to keep it. "You're right, Arthur," I said, my voice barely a murmur. I walked toward them, watching them stiffen. "I am a quiet woman, but you made a massive mistake when you assumed that quiet meant weak. You've spent months planning my downfall, haven't you? You gathered your witnesses, your papers, your lies. You forgot that I was watching." I turned my back to them, walking toward the study, and over my shoulder, I dropped the first stone. "You should have checked the security logs on your own private cloud, Arthur. The one you use to coordinate with your associates. The ones that have been forwarding your emails to my inbox for the last 6 weeks." Their faces went slack. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of the storm outside rattling the window panes. Arthur opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at Chloe, then back at me, his eyes wide with the sudden, sickening realization that the hunter had become the hunted. I didn't wait for his excuse. I reached for the telephone on the hall table, my finger hovering over the speed dial for my lawyer, and I looked at them both with a cold, hollow pity. "This isn't just a divorce, Arthur. This is an audit." The atmosphere in the foyer grew so heavy that it felt as if the oxygen had been extracted from the room. Arthur's face, once composed and arrogant, twitched with a frantic animal energy. He lunged forward as if to intercept me, but stopped short when he saw the glint of my smartphone. He knew, as I did, that the moment I made that call, the delicate house of cards he had spent years constructing would begin to collapse. "Eleanor, put the phone down," Arthur hissed, his voice dropping to a desperate, jagged whisper. "Think about what you're doing. You're destroying both of us. We can walk this back. We can go to counseling. We can—" "Counseling?" I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed off the marble floor. "You were going to have me institutionalized, Arthur. You weren't looking for a therapist. You were looking for a warden." Chloe, sensing her own comfortable lifestyle slipping through her manicured fingers, stepped forward with a shrill cry. "You stupid, delusional woman! You think you're so untouchable because of your name? You're just a ghost in this house. If you drag us down, I will make sure the entire city knows about your little episodes. I'll fabricate enough medical history to make sure you never work or hold social standing again." I stared at her, mesmerized by the sheer, unadulterated venom. "You've been watching too many soap operas, Chloe. You think reputation is built on gossip. It isn't. It's built on paper, and I have 10 years of your father's emails, bank statements, and the illicit contracts he signed with his architectural partners to skim funds from my trust. You didn't just target me. You targeted a legacy that has lawyers who specialize in making people like you disappear from polite society." Arthur's composure finally shattered. He gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles turning white. "You were always the soft one," he muttered, his eyes darting toward the front door as if contemplating flight. "How did you get the logs? I encrypted everything." "You used the same password for your secret cloud that you used for your Netflix account, Arthur," I said, my voice dripping with icy contempt. "You aren't a mastermind. You're a mediocre man who got greedy, and you let a spoiled girl talk you into ruining your life. You really thought you could play me?" I hit the speed dial. It wasn't my lawyer. It was the lead investigator at the firm that managed my family's holdings, the man who had looked after my grandfather's estate for 40 years. I put the phone on speaker, the rhythmic ringing sound acting as a countdown. Arthur let out a low, guttural sound of rage and lunged for the phone. He tackled me, his hands grabbing my wrists, the force of his weight knocking us both into the foyer side table. A porcelain vase, an antique I had cherished for years, shattered against the floor, shards skittering across the marble like jagged diamonds. I didn't scream. I fought back with a cold, focused fury I didn't know I possessed, digging my nails into his forearms until he recoiled. "Get out!" I shouted, the words tearing from my throat. "Get out of this house, Arthur! The police are on their way, and my security team is 10 minutes out. If you touch me again, I won't just ruin your career. I'll make sure you spend your next decade in a cell where you won't even have a window to look through." He stumbled back, panting, his face contorted in a mask of realization. He saw that the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. I wasn't the scared, lonely wife anymore. I was a force of nature reclaiming its territory. "Dad, do something!" Chloe shrieked, clutching her phone, likely trying to delete evidence on her end. "There's nothing to do, Chloe," Arthur breathed, his voice broken, his shoulders sagging as the fight left him. "She's already finished us." The second twist arrived then, in the form of a buzzing notification on my phone, an email from the bank. It was a freeze notice. Not on my accounts, but on the firm's joint accounts, triggered the moment I had initiated the data handover to my legal team. Their access was already gone. They weren't just leaving, they were paupers. Arthur looked at his phone, his face turning an ashen gray. "You froze the firm's operating capital? That's everything, Eleanor. That's the rent for the showroom, the payroll, everything." "It's not my concern," I replied, standing over the shards of the shattered vase. "You were so eager to merge our lives, Arthur. I just finished the paperwork." I walked toward the foyer, the debris crunching beneath my heels. I stood by the door, holding it open, a gesture of hollow politeness. "Pack your things. You have 20 minutes before the auditors arrive. And don't bother taking the art. I've already verified the provenance. Every piece in this house belongs to the estate, not to you. You came into this life with a drafting table and a dream of being rich. You're leaving with exactly that." Chloe looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and true, unadulterated fear. She realized that she wasn't the shark in this tank, she was the bait. And as Arthur slowly turned to walk up the stairs, a defeated man, I felt the first true breath of freedom in a decade. But the drama wasn't over. As Arthur reached the landing, he paused, turning back with a look of pure, concentrated evil. "You think you've won, Eleanor? You haven't seen the final play." He pulled a thumb drive from his pocket, tossing it onto the floor. "I didn't just plan for your collapse. I planned for a contingency." My blood turned to ice. He had one last card to play, and as he hit a button on his own phone, I heard the sound of my own voice, distorted and clipped, echoing through the house speakers. A fabrication of a confession I had never made, doctored to sound like I was the one who had stolen from the Foundation. The war wasn't over. It had just moved to the front page of every newspaper in the state. The sound of my own voice, twisted and manipulated through a digital deepfake, filled the silent foyer like a haunting echo. It was a masterpiece of technological malice, a recording where I appeared to be admitting to the very embezzlement Arthur had spent years committing. For a heartbeat, the air felt thin, and the floor threatened to buckle beneath me. Then, the ice in my veins turned to liquid nitrogen. I didn't panic. I didn't beg. I looked at Arthur, who stood on the landing with a triumphant, sickly grin, and I started to laugh. "Is that your big move?" I asked, my voice echoing, sharp and clear. "You think in this age of digital forensics, a grainy audio file is enough to hold up against a decade of bank audits and verified metadata? You're an architect, Arthur. You should know that if the foundation is built on sand, no amount of window dressing will keep the walls from collapsing." I pulled my tablet from my bag and tapped a single icon. "I didn't just spend the last 6 weeks gathering evidence on you. I spent them feeding your contingency plans into a private security firm's server. Every time you tried to access those files, every time you doctored an email, you were doing it on a network I controlled. That audio file? It has a digital watermark that traces directly back to the software license registered to your personal laptop. It's not a confession, Arthur. It's a signature." The color drained from his face, leaving him looking ancient and hollow. Chloe's phone buzzed incessantly. The investigators were already at the front gate, sirens silenced, but presence absolute. The transformation was complete. I was no longer the wife waiting for a seat at the table. I was the one who had bought the building. The next 3 months were a whirlwind of legal fire and brimstone. Arthur's firm didn't just fold, it was liquidated under a cloud of federal investigation into corporate espionage and